I want to bring your attention to a survey that we're going to be taking here in this coming week. We've contracted with an organization called GLOO, Gloo. And they have produced a survey now that has been probably being used by, with no exaggeration, literally thousands of churches across the country and, in fact, throughout the world. It's a way for them to hear responses from people on how they are experiencing spiritual growth in their own life. And it doesn't make any assumptions that people have to know so much or how little we know about our spiritual walk. It's really designed to kind of solicit from you ways in which you are seeing yourself grow in your own spiritual commitments, and also the catalysts that may be really active in your life. And so the survey has been designed so that you would learn a little bit more about yourself, and collectively, as a church, we are going to aggregate all of those responses so that we can understand what are some of the things that we're doing that are working really well, what are some things that maybe we can come alongside and improve so that the spiritual vitality that's experienced within our community can really just begin to take off. So along that line, on the way out today, you're going to receive a little package. And we know, like, when anybody is asking you to take a survey, it's like, oh my gosh, right? But we have like little Hershey Kisses in these little packages. We're not above bribing anybody. We also have like some peanut almond cashew mix, right? And then there's a card, and that card will be just like you see up on a screen. And if you have a smartphone, all you have to do is just take a picture of that QR code, and it will automatically bring you to the survey. It'll take anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes. We took everybody on our staff, and we sat down during one of our staff meetings, and everybody took it together. The minute you hit send, you automatically get an update that gives you an indication of where you see yourself. And so it's a instant feedback on all the answers that you have provided about where they see you in this spiritual continuum. We want to be able to, one thing I always forget to tell people, these answers are absolutely anonymous. Nobody's going to know what you are, how you're filling out these surveys except for you. But we get an aggregate, just all of those answers pooled together. And they're going to come to us based on the various campuses. So we can see what's working in Raymond, what's working in Kittery, what's working here at Greenland. And it will provide us some really good understanding in terms of how we might come alongside and help us to become disciples who are making disciples. So this week, we're probably going to be obnoxious. Because I'm just telling you right now, I'm going to send out an email. I want to remind everybody, because if the survey is going to mean anything, it's going to be because we had a huge turnout from people to do it. You could do it on your phone. You could do it on an iPad. You can get online and do it via your computer. If you don't have any of those things, we have them here. And we're setting up stations so that people could just, after the service, they could sit down, they could take the survey, and this way it would give us this aggregate response. So I'm really looking forward to it. It's a way for us to just get some really good information. And I'm the kind of guy that thinks that facts are friends. So the more you know, the better off you're going to be. And then this way we can plan and we can begin to really meet needs. Because I think more than anything, in the culture in which we're living, Jesus, he promises us peace. He promises us life. Why would we not pay more attention to that? And as a church, that's why we exist. There's no other reason than to just let this gospel be made known. And we want to do it that much better. So don't forget your little package on the way out. And you can't eat the Hershey Kisses until you've taken the exam. How's that? Or taken the survey. All right. Why don't we just bow our heads for a word of prayer, and then we'll open up the word together. Father, we are thankful to you for a revelation that you have given to us of your Son. As we properly understand your message and this ministry, it opens up all kinds of possibilities to us. Among those top are the promise of experiencing peace and joy, love. A promise that the very fruit of the Spirit that now resides in us will help us to produce patience. It'll bring a sense of gentleness and faithfulness and kindness and even self-control. This is the fruit that you promise as a result of the Spirit beginning to lead and direct our thoughts and our actions. So there's so much to be gained by understanding the tenets of this gospel. There are sound reasons on which to build this life of faith. And I pray, Lord, that as we open up the scriptures together, that your voice will be heard loud and clear, challenging us, Lord, to just draw near, to put this yoke on so that we might learn something more of you, and in the process learn more about ourselves, about the world, and of the future. And as always, we'll be careful to give you all the praise in Christ's name. Amen. You know, have you ever gone through a particular experience where you walked away and you just said to yourself, that was a complete waste of my time? Has that ever happened to you? I'm sure it has. But here's a follow-up question to that. Having had that initial kind of reaction, have you ever also then, in hindsight, discovered that the experience was much more valuable than you ever really acknowledged at the moment? It may have been painful lessons to learn, but somehow going through that experience, and now that you're on this other side and you're having a little bit of an opportunity to look through a rearview mirror and look back, you actually turn around and said, you know what, I actually learned some things to do, or I learned some things not to do ever again, right? It's a way in which now you begin to navigate life with a little bit more of little bit more wisdom. Now, we have to be careful that we don't draw some hasty conclusions, though we're in the midst of those kinds of circumstances, right? Because we might judge poorly. And sometimes you can go through hard times and God appears as if he's silent. That you get the impression that maybe you're not as big a priority to him. Maybe that God is just distracted, or worse, oblivious to your concerns. You could feel like that in life. Like, why is everything against me? Why is this not moving forward? Why am I always having to deal with these issues? And when you pray, when you call out, it doesn't seem like there are answers that are coming too quickly. And if we're not careful, we're not hitting the pause button long enough to just maybe learn a lesson or two that God would really have us to learn. Well, last week we looked at a passage where there was a Canaanite woman who had come to Jesus with a deep concern. And she could have easily have drawn some wrong conclusions. But we discovered that Jesus actually did engage her. And he steered these events in a way that would serve his will and his purposes. And this woman, well, she found that a lot of her concerns were then being addressed. You know, one of the things that we find about God's will and purposes is sometimes it's not always so clear in the very beginning, right? That's been part of the issue as we've been opening up the Gospel of Matthew. The spiritual leadership in Jesus' day had grown some calloused hearts towards this work that Jesus was presenting. They looked at his motives, and they found ways to criticize him and to, caricature, build a caricature about him that was meant to really undermine any of the popularity or authority that he was demonstrating in that day. And so Jesus was seeking to address this unbelief that was manifesting itself, that was keeping them from really experiencing something of God's grace in some increasing measure. However, they missed the opportunity to know Jesus. They missed the opportunity to know the one who was claiming to be the Messiah. And so we found that Jesus moved on. He moved to a place called Tyre and Sidon, seacoast towns in what was then Phoenicia. The world in Sidon and Tyre, that region of the world, it was very sharply carved out in terms of culture and economics and religion. It had a way of putting people in certain little pigeonholes, and they didn't really mix a whole lot together. It was rather contentious. What kept everybody on the same page, though, was that Tyre and Sidon were very wealthy cities. It was a seacoast town that really brought many of the world's goods through its ports and out into the rest of the world. So it was buzzing with activity. There was all this clash of cultures all around them. Very cosmopolitan city, but a very worldly city at the same time. Historically, the cities of Sidon and Tyre, they were arch enemies to the rest of Israel, constantly at war with them. Give you an idea? Sidon had a king. His name was Ethbaal. May not sound anything to you, except that he had a daughter, who I think you may have heard of. Her name was Jezebel. Jezebel married Ahab, and it was the demise of Israel. So see, this little seacoast town plays a big role in the spiritual climate that was taking place in Israel. But do you remember that Jesus, at one time in his ministry, said these words? He said, "Ask, and it shall be given to you," right? "Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened." Jesus has been sharing this message, and as he goes to this region of Tyre and Sidon, he comes across a woman who is a Canaanite, who probably heard about Jesus and his ministry because she confronts him with a problem, and she addresses him as Son of David, a title that was used for the Messiah. She addresses him as Lord, a term that was one that showed deference to the person that you were speaking to. So here you have this Gentile Canaanite woman addressing Jesus in a way that not even the spiritual leaders of his day addressed him. She must have learned something about Jesus' words, because she comes asking, right? But Jesus ignores her. The text says that Jesus was silent to her call for mercy and help because her daughter had been experiencing, this torment from evil spirits. She was looking for healing, and she was crying out to Jesus for mercy. But he just paid no attention, or so it seems. I suggested last week that maybe Jesus was just playing hard to get because he was trying to really discover what is it that this woman really wanted. She didn't only come asking, she came seeking. But do you remember what Jesus said to her? Jesus looked at her and said, I have come for the lost sheep of Israel. Now, if you were this woman, and you're coming asking, and you're coming seeking, and the only response you get is somebody that's not paying attention, and when he does pay attention, he turns around and says, yeah, it's just not a priority right now. How would you feel? You could see how that could play in your head, right? Like, this doesn't matter. Like, maybe I got this all wrong. But you notice in the story, the lady kept on knocking. She kept on pursuing. And Jesus opened that door. In fact, he says to this woman that you have great faith and that your request will be granted. And here you have the Messiah sent to the nation of Israel to fulfill all of this prophetic word, being shunned by the religious leaders of his day, many still on that kind of, crowd experience that are just wowed by his teaching or by his miracles, but not really quite ready yet to commit. There is this growing group of people who are convinced, but you see such a varied response. And now Jesus goes all the way to the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, and there he finds this Canaanite Gentile woman, and she is all open to everything and anything that Jesus is going to do for her. And Jesus commends her for her great faith. What she discovered was that Jesus is the Savior of not only the Jew, but also of the Gentile. That lesson is not going to be lost on the disciples. In fact, there is a passage that's found in Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. I'd like to read that for you. It's a great text. Paul writes this to the church at Rome. And this is what he says. He says, I am not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. First for the Jew and then for the Gentile. For in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. So you see, there is this righteousness that's coming, and Jesus is correct. The Messiah was coming to the lost sheep of Israel first. Because all these promises were promises that God had made way back through Abraham, and then through Isaac and Jacob and Moses, until finally all those promises, they come to a head in the birth of Jesus. And he is now this Jewish Messiah that is going to come, but just like the promise was given to Abraham, that through you and your descendant, all the nations of the world would be blessed, Jesus has come in fulfillment of these promises, but the promises then were also then so that all the world would be blessed. Which is why it's such a tragedy that Jesus comes to his own, and his own received him not. There's this passage then that I want to turn your attention to, because following this experience with this woman, it says this in Matthew 15, verse 29. It says, Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. And then he went up on a mountainside and sat down. If you've ever visited the Holy Land, the Sea of Galilee, it is flanked by ascending mountains and hillsides around them. And so you're not told exactly where Jesus was on the Sea of Galilee, but there's going to be a lot of hints in this text, so I want you to pay careful attention as we walk our way through it. I will tell you this, though. There is a parallel account in the Gospel of Mark, and in Mark chapter 7, it says that Jesus left the region of Tyre and Sidon and went down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. So it kind of pinpoints a little bit about where this is, and it's important for our study. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a history lesson here, okay? I'm going to put up a map. In this map, you'll see that towards the bottom center of the screen is the Sea of Galilee. Over on the seacoast of the Mediterranean, up on the top is Sidon, and below is the cities of Tyre. Jesus had left the top part of the Sea of Galilee, and that little red line brings him all the way up to those seacoasts where I just shared in review of what we looked at last week, right, with this Canaanite woman. Well, Jesus would leave there and then travel back over north of the Sea of Galilee, come all the way down on the east side, and then come to the east side of the Sea of Galilee. On the bottom of your screen, you see that there's a little word there. It says the Decapolis. And then on the other side, you see it says Galilee, right? These are the territories in Jesus' day. So when you read your Bible and he says he went up to Galilee, you could see that Galilee was over on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. Why is this so important? Because if you know something about that Sea of Galilee, on the west side, the side that was closest to the Mediterranean, it was predominantly Jews. In the Decapolis, they had their own political systems. They had their own rulers. They were completely autonomous from the nation of Israel. There was mostly Gentile territory. If you know your Bibles, you know that when Jesus first started his ministry, at the end of chapter 4, right before he's going to go and begin the Sermon on the Mount, it says that people from Jerusalem, Judea, Galilee, the Decapolis, all these people came to Jesus bringing their sick, and Jesus healed them all. And then Jesus went up and he sat down and he began to give them what we know now as the Sermon on the Mount. So why am I telling you this? Because I want you to look at a map of today. You see in the center there, that little blue, that's the Sea of Galilee. But today, so just so you know, on the left-hand side, right, on the west side of the Sea of Galilee, up to the north, that's Lebanon now. Syria is on the other side. Jordan is on the bottom. Israel makes up the rest of that portion of land. You see that lighter section that's right, it just covers part of the eastern side of that lake? Anybody know what that is? That's the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights is now, I'll give you another picture of that, and you can see now that whole center section, that whole valley, and then coming alongside the other rim of the Sea of Galilee. During Jesus' day, this was all part of this Gentile territory. Herod's son, Philip, presided over a good chunk of that land, but there was all sections of that land that were completely Gentile. Let me tell you how beautiful this place is. Here's a photo of what it looks like looking down on the Sea of Galilee. So this is this land that I'm talking to you about. And why am I stressing where it is and this historical significance? Because what I want you to know is that Jesus just finished leaving this region of Tyre and Sidon, Gentile territories, where he's confronted by a Canaanite woman and embraces her and her faith, and he heals her daughter. When all of Israel in the leadership that had come up from Jerusalem, they're plotting now on how they're going to kill Jesus. So those who seem to be so far away from God are the ones that seem to be embracing him. And then he leaves there and he travels all the way over to the eastern shores of the Sea of Galilee, which is telling you again that this is Gentile territory. So he's still dealing with those who would be ostracized by that Jewish community. Let's go on with our story. So now in verse 30, it says, great crowds came to Jesus, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and they laid them at his feet, and Jesus healed them all. This time, there's no ignoring. This time, there's no veiled, statements. Jesus is just embracing the opportunity, and he is healing all of them. Healing all of those who are decidedly Gentiles. So here is the Messiah who has come to the household of Israel, and now he's engaged all of this Gentile territory. They're bringing the sick and the infirm. And notice what the text says. They were lame, they were blind, they were crippled, they were mute, and many others. Where did you hear that before? See, Jesus is healing Gentiles. Early on, if you've been following along in our study in Matthew, we were in chapter 11 when John was imprisoned. And John was in prison, and he begins to hear that Jesus had healed a Roman centurion's son, a servant. And that Jesus was also now hanging out with the likes of Matthew, the tax collector. In fact, he had called him into his service to be part of the 12. John, who is adamant and out there preaching of the coming of this kingdom of God, is now probably wondering what in the world is going on here. John was there when Jesus was baptized, and the Spirit of God descended like a dove, and the Father said, "This is my Son in whom I am pleased. Listen to him." John saw all of that. But now John is put in prison because of a whim of Herod Antipas. He will eventually have his head chopped off. But he's wondering, did I get it wrong? Is this the right Jesus? Because the Messiah, he's supposed to come, he's supposed to restore all things. But the conception was that it had to happen like this. But he didn't realize that Jesus is coming the first time was to give his life a ransom for the sins of man. Jesus' first coming was all about him taking our sins and nailing them to a cross so that you and I would be forgiven, that we would receive then the gift of the Holy Spirit, and that Holy Spirit now indwelling us would begin to illumine our minds to the truth of what God is saying in his word. And that very residence of the Spirit of God in you, it says he promises will bring love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, kindness, self-control. So, John wants to know. He's in prison, and he sends a delegation of his own disciples to find out, is Jesus, are you the one that we were expecting? Because he's a little confused now. This is what Jesus says to him. It's back in Matthew 11, verse 4 and 5. He says, Jesus replies, he says, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight. The lame walk. Those who have leprosy are cured. The deaf hear, the dead are raised. The good news is preached to the poor. All of those are things that were prophesied about the Messiah, that when he would come, he would do all these things. The reason why I'm reading this to you now is because, see, Jesus, to quell that kind of doubt that may have been brewing inside of John the Baptist, he just says, you go back and tell John what you see and hear. Because that was all happening in this Jewish context now, right? The Messiah was coming into his own. And now we're told that Jesus is in a Gentile region, and he's doing the same thing for them. And not only that, look at the response. In verse 31, it says, the people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, and the blind seeing. And they praised the God of Israel. Not only did Jesus heal the Gentiles, but now he's receiving praise from the Gentiles. Why would you say, in response to all the good things that you would say, see, this is a hint that this is truly a Gentile territory, because why would you have to write in that they praised the God of Israel? If it was all in a Jewish context, they would just simply say they praised God. Because for them, they would understand that God was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the creator of all things. But Matthew feels it's important to inform you and I that they were praising the God of Israel, because this is a Gentile group. And now Jesus is receiving praise from Gentiles, while the very leadership of Israel, they were just raising their voices in contempt, saying, yes, Jesus has been doing all these healings, but he's been doing it by virtue of the authority of the prince of demons. And so we have now Gentiles responding. They're not missing the opportunity. They're understanding now. Let's go on. Look at verses 32 and 33. It says, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. I don't want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. His disciples answered, where could we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd? There must have been something really special about Jesus that he could hold their attention out in the midst of a wilderness here for 3 days. Whatever provisions they may have brought with them, by the end of those 3 days, they need to be replenished. But did you hear this story before? Doesn't it sound awfully familiar? Because in chapter 14, it's almost verbatim exactly this story. Except, though, that, as we're going to discover, there are just some key elements here. But the response from the disciples is still the same. Like, how are we going to feed all these people? The last time Jesus took 5 loaves and 2 fish and fed them all. This time Jesus says, look, we got to feed them. And they answer, where are we going to get the provisions? If you ever are tempted to think that life in the days of Jesus would have been so sublime, if I'd only could have been one of those disciples that walked the countryside with Jesus, everything would be just so wonderful. These guys seemed a little obtuse. What happened the last time? Did they have the resources to feed those 5,000 men, not counting women and children? They had to look to Jesus, who multiplied them in a miraculous way. And they took up what? 12 basketfuls. All right. They should have remembered Who had the resources? Or, can I offer you another suggestion? Let's just say maybe they understood that Jesus was going to be the one to bring these resources. So why the hesitancy? Is it possible that they take it for granted that while Jesus may use his messianic power to feed a Jewish crowd, maybe they're a little suspect as to whether or not his concern would be the same for a Gentile crowd? And if so, they really haven't learned the lesson from the Canaanite woman, did they? Remember when Jesus said to the woman, is it right for me to take the bread that belongs to the children and give it to their dogs? Remember when he said that? Demonstrating that there was a priority here that needed to be mandated. I know that you guys love your pets. Sometimes you might love them more than you love your own kids if you have them. But there is something that's saying, well, maybe we should feed the kids first and then the dogs. But the woman, when she hears that, she doesn't storm off. She just looks at Jesus and says, yes, that's true, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the table. And Jesus' response to her is, woman, you have great faith. Because she understood. She wasn't there with wrong motives. Why am I bringing this up to you? Because evidently, maybe the disciples, hasn't sunk in yet that Jesus, while he came to the lost sheep of Israel first, the Messiah would also come to bless all the world. I'll have a little bit more to say about that in a second here, but let's just work our way through the rest of this passage. Look at verse 34. Jesus says, how many loaves do you have? 7, they replied, and a few small fish. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground, and when they took the 7 loaves and the fish, and when he had given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and they in turn to the people. If you're following, it seems like it's a remake of the old story, except this time the audience is different. But Jew and Gentile are treated the same way. Remember back in chapter 14, it says this, it says, in that setting, Jesus told them all to sit on the grass, and he took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves, and then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. The same manner in which Jesus addressed his Father in heaven and provided for the needs of the people, it didn't matter if they were Jews or they were Gentiles. And it wouldn't matter when he would go to a cross. Because that very act of taking that bread and breaking it, can you remember any other time that that's going to come up? How about on the eve of Jesus' crucifixion? When they're there celebrating God's deliverance of Egypt from the nation of Israel, Passover. And at that supper, Jesus would take the bread and break it. And he would redefine that element and say to them, this is now my body, which is broken for you. I believe Jesus is saying the same thing to these Gentiles. I have come to die for you. And not only that, do you remember when Jesus healed that Roman centurion's servant? It says in the text that Jesus was astonished by this man's faith. And he looked at his disciples and says, I tell you the truth, I have not seen such great faith in all of Israel. And right after Jesus says that, this is what he says in Matthew 8. He says, I say to you that many will come from the east and the west, Jew, Gentile, and will take their places at the feast of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Not only is Jesus treating them both the same, but Jesus says that they are going to be welcomed at this heavenly feast of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Everyone is going to have a seat at that table. That's awesome, isn't it? And then he ends this way. It says they all ate and were satisfied. And afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate were 4,000, besides women and children. A little bit less than the first miracle, but still something that was way beyond the provision of somebody just sharing a lunch. Now, here's a couple of things in closing. See this text where it says they picked up 7 basketfuls? How many did they pick up the last time? 12. In that context, you could see that the 12 in the Jewish minds was associated with what? The 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 basket now is God saying, I have come, the bread from heaven, to feed you. 7 is a number in the Bible that's also used pretty significantly. 7 is a number that speaks of completion, perfection. 7, it speaks of something that is complete. Because this work of God is going to be complete when all the nations of the earth come to know him. And just so you don't think that I'm making all this stuff up, it's a very interesting thing. In the passage in Matthew 14, when he was feeding the Jews, there's a word there. It says that they picked up 12 basketfuls, right? The word for basket is a very Hebrew word. And that word that speaks of that was kophinos is the name, right? It was a very Hebrew word for what was known to the people in that culture. Guess what? In this text, when it says they picked up 7 basketfuls, it's a different word that speaks more of the Gentile environment. And just so you don't think that I'm making that up, in a few verses, we're going to get to Matthew 16, where Jesus is going to kind of chide the disciples a little bit, and he's going to tell them this. He says, do you still not understand? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many kophinos you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many seers you gathered? See, the text is suggesting that it's not just a stylistic variation, it's very intentional. It's God saying, look, the same miracle I did for the Jew, I'm doing for the Gentile. I am the bread of heaven that's going to feed them as well. Jesus has come for all people. Think about the days in which we're living now and how people want to marginalize this work of Jesus. Jesus is very clear about his ministry. The Canaanite woman and the feeding of the 4,000 are just a foretaste of what is going to come. Think about this. The boundaries of culture and politics, of religion and economics, of gender, they're all transcended by this work of Jesus. There's nobody that's untouchable. from the high to the low, those who are far off and those who are near. The pressing concern is whether or not they're going to miss the opportunity to know him and to really even understand the importance of this message. Because they're so caught up in their own prejudices that they're not even going to cross the street. Remember the story of the Good Samaritan? The priest walked on the other side, the Levite walked on the other side. It was the Samaritan who in that day was the lower than the low. It's like an oxymoron. How can you be a good Samaritan? Because we all know Samaritans are like dirt. But in Jesus' story, it was the Good Samaritan that showed compassion to that man. See, this is the Jesus that I'm presenting to you, that Matthew's presenting to us. Now, at that time in history, this much is clear. Jesus is the Messiah promised to Israel, the Messiah who will bless all the nations of the world. He's the bread of life, but he did come to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. At this moment in history, we're commissioned to follow his example in earnest. Now you and I are to share the good news of the kingdom of heaven without constraints raised by race or culture or politic or religion. The good news of Jesus and the message of this kingdom is meant to not only transform your life and your heart, but God says, in Jesus, I'm going to reconcile all the world. So never forget, God's people are the salt of the earth. God's people are the light of the world. We're never to lose our saltiness, and we're never to hide this light. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Let's pray. Father, I want to thank you for this text. In a casual read, it just seems like a repeat until we take these words a little bit more seriously and recognize what you're doing is removing centuries and centuries of prejudice and encumbrance and obstacles and giving us concrete examples that force us to look at all of humanity as a people who were created in your image. There is no one outside that you cannot touch. We just got to take advantage of the opportunity. We can't miss it. We need to understand it. For when we do, it changes us. And we become your seed planted in a world and we'll change it. Give us that strength and that conviction, and we'll be careful to give you all the praise in Jesus' name. Amen.